There you go.
Oregon State resident.
There you
All right, let's get started. So welcome back. Hope you're enjoying the fun fake spring stuff we've got going on. We get 70-degree weather, then we get snow. It's spring in LaGrange, so glad to have you all here. So as we get started for today and ease into today's class, I do want to take note of something I'm asking you to complete by this Friday. So several of you have a device with you, such as a laptop or phone. If you do and you have access, what I'm going to ask you to do is to just take a couple minutes and complete the presentation availability form, which is on the front page of Canvas. I also included that as a link in a recent announcement that I sent out before class. Basically, you can access it right here. The availability form is a chance for you to just mark particular days that you know that you will or will not be able to attend class. The purpose of this is that as we go into the interviews, right, you'll be working in partnerships and doing interviews in the class. I want to make sure that I'm scheduling you for a time that doesn't conflict with any sort of extracurricular travel or anything else. So please mark off days that you know you can attend. If you have days where you might be traveling, you might be on travel schedule, please mark as unable to attend. That way, we can make sure that we're accounting for a potential travel day. So I'll give you a couple minutes. You have access to a device to do that. And then once you have, we'll get started. If you don't have access to a device or you're not able to complete the form right now, I'll just ask that you make sure to do that by Friday.
I think you have those 30 minutes but I think you do do one back first two right now. The jamboree. Yeah. So Friday.
You know that you still have some things up in the air, like you're still waiting on a schedule or you have paperwork or information you're still waiting on, that's okay. You're welcome to complete it later. I'll also ask that if you have a change in your schedule, so you've submitted the form, but you realize, oh geez, I had this thing I forgot about, or there's a conflict that comes up later, then I'll just ask you to resubmit the form and just email me to let me know that you have resubmitted it.
Thank you.
All right. Is there anybody who is working on a form right now who would like some more time? Great. So thank you for those of you who have the chance to do that. Again, if you haven't, please make sure to do that by the end of the day on Friday. And then after that, what I'll be doing is sending a partnership and schedule for the first interviews of the class, the survey interviews. So we'll be taking some time next week to dive more into survey interviews, their structure, and some expectations for that style of interview. So just know that that's on the horizon and that this form will help with knowing the day that you present. So as a quick recap of the stuff that we went over on Monday, we really went into the idea of questions, right? Questions are the beating heart of interviews. The whole purpose of an interview, right, is to ask questions to gather information. Good questions give us what we need, whether we're trying to figure out somebody's fit for a job, whether we're trying to diagnose and understand a health issue. Good questions can quite literally save lives, right? But bad questions waste time, waste money, and prevent us from effectively reaching the goals that we had for the particular interview. We talked about how different types of questions can be utilized and also some of the challenges and pitfalls associated with using questions too. So this is directly helpful for you for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you are doing your interviews in class, you are going to be developing questions. So I think this is a great way for you to think about the types of questions that you ask, why you've chosen those questions, and how you can avoid some problems in the interview questioning process. And secondarily, this is useful for you as you get into the interview observation essay assignment, because one thing you'll be able to pay attention to are the types of questions that are being asked and why those questions are being framed the way they are. So last class, we went over, again, some of these different types of questions, how they're used, right? Open-ended questions that generally invite people to respond however they would like. Moderately open, right in the middle. Tell me about the new features of your phone, right? It's somewhere in between. Closed questions, those might be yes or no style questions, which have bipolar options as response. One other type of closed-ended question that somebody might consider is what's known as a scale question, right? So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree, how do you feel you would recommend EOU to another student, right? So something like that can be really useful as you're gathering data. Also, closed-ended questions can be really useful in gathering like demographic information. For instance, gathering something like your age or age range, getting information about gender, and so on, if that's relevant to the goals of your interview too, right? So think about closed-ended questions as a way to get that crucial information that you need in order to fulfill the requirements. You might be thinking about the combination of those, and we'll be talking today about how the structure of an entire interview can be utilizing these different types of questions and organizing them in an effective way. So today, we'll be talking about an interview guide, right? One of the things that you will be turning in with each of the interviews that you give in class, right? 3 interviews being the survey interview, the employment interview, and then a specialized interview where you get to choose an area you're interested in. You will be turning in an interview guide for each of those interviews, right? So when you take on the role of an interviewer, you have material that's prepared, it's ready to go, so that you can ask questions and engage with the interviewee in an effective way. This is something that is very commonly used right here at EOU whenever we're hiring somebody new. We as a committee have to develop a set of questions to ask candidates. We have to figure out what it is we need to learn about them. And one thing we oftentimes do is we look at the resumes, we look at the applications, and we figure out, okay, we have this information. What is it that we don't know that we want to learn about our candidates? And we develop a set of questions usually based on that. So we'll talk about how you can develop your own interview guide and use that interview guide in the assignments in this class. We'll talk about different types of sequences, right? How you frame and arrange the questions in the way that you do to fulfill the goals of an interview. We'll talk about climate, right? How do we develop an effective environment in which people feel comfortable and able to participate effectively? So what I think is useful to start with is the idea of an interview guide, right? Think about the interview guide as kind of like an outline. If you are an interviewer and you are creating an interview, what is the information that you need to have in front of you? You might think about this almost like a script, if it's a very structured and closed interview, right? When I worked in customer satisfaction, one thing that we did was We were given a very clear script with how we would address the questions, and we were even asked as we were hearing responses to fill in based on where those responses were coming from. So we would like have the audio on, and we were working through a document that was essentially the interview guide to fill in the data, right? So the interview guide is not necessarily a list of questions. It can include the questions, right? But it's more about some of the ways that you include other statements, you include framing, you include the possibility of certain types of follow-up questions. So what you're doing is essentially allowing the interview to play out in a clear way. If all you did in the interview was just ask a list of questions, right? There was no introduction, there was no conclusion, there was no transition. The interviewee is going to feel like it's an interrogation, or they're going to feel a little bit confused. So part of the idea of an interview guide and the role of an interviewer is that you're helping to kind of thread the interviewee along. You're kind of saying, hey, thank you so much for making it here. The purpose of this interview is to gather information about current students at EOU. And so let's get started by talking a little bit about some basic information. Can you tell me your year in school, right? So that can be a way for us to understand why a certain question is being asked. For instance, this is an example here, right? We might see a list of questions such as, what are the necessary components to be considered self-direction, and so on and so forth. So you can see here with like number 5 in particular, there is a sequence where they're breaking down a larger question into a few different parts. One of the challenges that we brought up last class is the use of a double barred question, right? A question that's very long, that's complicated, and that has a lot of components is generally not a good idea, because oftentimes people will only respond to part of the question. People will get confused because they don't remember the entirety of the question. So breaking up large questions into chunks is a really good way to make sure that people understand what's going on. In preparation for this class, I will also be allowing you to submit a rough draft of the interview guide, and I will also be allowing you to, I'll be including an example interview guide outline that you can use as well. So the interview guide, right, is going to look different depending upon the level of structure in the interview itself. If you are doing a very open-ended interview, generally speaking, you're not going to be including a whole lot of information in your guide. You might have some notes, statements, and information about the people involved in the interview process, but generally you're not going to be including as much of a formal structure. Guides should be good structure and substructure, right? One of the tricks here is that you need to understand how the interview is going to break down. And as you're going through, right, making sure that you as an interviewer are on track. Oftentimes, you will take notes in the interview guide. You'll check things off as you're working through. Perhaps you have a bank of like extra questions and things you want to ask if there's more time in the interview, right? So you have a lot of options here with regard to how you utilize interview structure and organization. So there are a few different ways that you can use an outline to help to follow along with an interview. One of them is a topical, right? So a topical way of sequencing or organizing an interview is to go over various topics and issues. So if you've taken a class like public speaking, you might be familiar with the idea that there are different organizational styles as you present body points in a speech, or if you're working on messing for a class, right? The topical style is a way of transitioning. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit with an interviewee about their experiences in middle school. Then you want to talk to them about their experiences with extracurriculars, right? So you're picking two different areas that you choose to focus on. One way that you might do this is you might have 3 or 4 questions that align with a particular category of the group. So for example, you might ask 3 or 4 very introductory questions designed to get demographic information. You might ask 3 or 4 questions about middle school experience. You might ask 3 or 4 questions about extracurriculars. The goal here, as you're thinking about and developing the outline, is to ask yourself, how do these questions align with the topics that I need to make sure are covered? We're doing a healthcare interview, right? What are the issues related to physical, mental health? Those might be two different categories. Or we're doing something like an employment interview. Perhaps somebody wants to know about previous work experience, and perhaps they want to know about somebody's service qualifications. There's also what's known as a journalist guide, right? So this is generally if you're doing an information seeking interview, such as interviewing somebody to get kind of a video or audio clip that can be used. So in these situations, generally speaking, you have a very clear agenda. Tell me what happened. I heard that there was, a lot of problems that were going on at this concert. Tell me what happened at this concert. So generally speaking, there's a lot more structure. The time sequence, right? So this is really useful if you're trying to develop a narrative in a more open-ended style with an interviewee, and you're trying to gain an understanding of their lived experience and perspective. So under a time sequence, you might start by trying to understand some of the early interests of a student. Maybe you move on to their experiences in middle school, and then you talk about their experiences in high school. So you use that sequence to try to get an understanding of the overall trajectory of a student who might be interested in joining SVOU. Another idea is the use of a cause to effect structure. In other words, you start to ask questions about the sort of cause or reason behind something, and then you start to talk about some of the impact and implications of something, right? So one example we oftentimes see in a lot of kind of late night or celebrity types of interviews, such as the one that we saw last week, generally involve asking, okay, well, what got you into acting? What got you into this film or television show? What got you into making this music, right? And then how does it feel, right, to be an overnight celebrity, to be viral on TikTok, right? So it's oftentimes understanding the perspective somebody has coming in and then the thing that happens coming out. Another way we see this structure commonly used is in something like an employment interview. One of the most common questions that you will receive when you're interviewed for a job is describe a challenge or issue that you dealt with. What were the steps that you took in order to deal with that, right? So what was the cause of the problem? What was the effect or way that you addressed that problem? And then similarly, we have a problem solution sequence. So one of the challenges with this one is it can be a more loaded question where you're kind of teasing out a specific response, like how do you solve the problem, which implies that somebody did successfully solve the issue. So under this sequence, you're framing an issue. This can be really common, for instance, if you have someone such as a lawyer who's trying to understand an issue that occurred or an incident, right? Explain to me what it is that was going on and explain how your organization or group worked to address it. So that type of sequence can be useful too, right? So as you're structuring an outline or interview guide, you can think about these structures as a way of helping you to organize the goals that you're looking for here, right? The easiest way to start with creating a guide is to ask yourself, what do I need to know? What type of interview is this? And given that basic information, right, how can I structure questions in such a way that I'm getting that relevant information that I need? In other words, a bad way to do an interview is just generate a list of questions that you think are interesting or thought-provoking or might connect to the topic, right? A good way of structuring an interview is to understand how the series of questions you're using is directly corresponding to an overall goal. So there are going to be two parts for the attendance for today that I'll be asking you to do on your own. For part number one, I want you to imagine that you're asking questions about a student's time here at EOU. First of all, how might you structure your interview questions in a time sequence? And second of all, how might you structure your interview questions in a topical sequence? I want you to think about the types of questions that you might ask and how you might categorize or arrange these questions with that in mind. So I'll give you some time to work on this, and we'll talk about this together in just a few minutes. Give folks about 2, 3 more minutes to work on this. go ahead and finish your current thought. So you're asking a student about their time here at Eastern Oregon University. You're trying to gather more information, learn a little bit more about their experience. So let's start first with a time sequence. So how might you structure interview questions in a time sequence? I will take a volunteer who might be interested in sharing how they explained their organization. Yeah. So that's a good starting point, right? What might be some additional questions building off of that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, they already did contract. So you say, what was the hardest challenges you faced? How did you overcome it?
Right. So you have a question, right, that's inviting or starting a time sequence, right? The question alone would not be the time sequence, right? But it's a way to begin that process. So one question you might ask within the broader time sequence is to say, the challenges or issues coming into you, right? Then you might, as you say, present a question about the challenges facing you currently in UU, and maybe you have a question that's talking about their future plans. What do they want to do after college? What are they looking at next, right? So past, present, future is a really good way of structuring a time sequence in the use of questions. That can be really good if you're trying to gather information about somebody's plans or intentions. Again, trying to understand where they're coming from, what they're looking at and choosing to do in the future. They go into grad school, do they have a job lined up or internship? Like, what is it that they're planning on doing? And using information from the present and past to better determine where that student is coming from. What about a topical sequence? What would be an example of how a topical sequence could be used? Yes.
I use questions around sports. Like
Okay.
whether they're a student athlete, whether they're the events and what their relationship with sports and you.
So somebody's an athlete, right? There's questions about their own attendance and participation. There's questions about their like engagement in other activities or in events. That's a good way to do it, right? You have a broad topic, but within that, you might have some smaller topics that you're interested in exploring a little bit more too, right? I think the key here is that a sequence, right, is a series. It's a series of questions, right? So a single question can't be a time sequence or a topical sequence, but you could use multiple questions and structure those multiple questions such that it's fitting into one of those two. So as you're working through and developing questions for this class, you might think, how am I structuring perhaps from past, present, and future? Or how am I structuring based on those areas of interest as pointed out, right? Your interest in athletics and participation currently, and your interest in involvement with other teams. So there are a few other things that I think are good for us to know with regard to scheduling, organization, and the development of the interview process. And then I'm going to return to you to a part 2 for your attendance for the day. So when it comes to scheduling, right, this refers to the degree to which an interview is following the script or following the guide, right? This is going to depend a little bit about the regulations of your organization or group that's conducting the interview, the goals you have, and so on. If you ever do research, right, including research here at UU, there is what's called the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, that you have to get approval from in order to do research involving human subjects. There is the, might be familiar with the famous Philip Zimbardo prison experiment, right, where people were randomly assigned as inmates or prisoners, prison inmates or like wardens. And as a result, there was intense psychological trauma from the weeks that people had in those different roles. As a result of that process, there was an ethical review that was created. So before you do like research that involves human subjects, you have to get approval, right? So whenever I've done interview research, for like a journal article, I have to get approval first. And as part of that, I have to develop a list of questions and structure so that people review it and make sure that that is, following the guidelines. So sometimes you have highly structured and scheduled interviews where you have to use the exact same format every time. Non-scheduled interviews, right, are ones that generally have no questions prepared in advance. So sometimes this is good if you just want to have a meaningful conversation with somebody, you want to explore a topic, or the interview is really about letting the person kind of guide the discussion for themselves. So for instance, perhaps you've scored an interview with somebody that's like a famous celebrity or somebody that you really value and look on highly, and you just want to learn more about them. A moderately scheduled interview is one that has some questions and pros. It has some things that you have prepared. There are some things you want to hit on, like you want to talk about this musician's life, a little bit about their background, about what they're working on now, but you do have a lot of space for openness. So the more highly scheduled interviews like this one are generally ones where you're following that same order and that same format each time. So one of the things that's important for you to look at, right, is to figure out what is the level of scheduling and preparation for this interview based on the goals and the norms that you need to follow, right? Again, one thing that's commonly looked for in an employment interview is that people are asking the same types of questions to each candidate. If you are asking very different questions to candidate A than candidate B, you're very much comparing apples to oranges, and it's going to be a lot harder for you to make a decision about who to hire because you can't compare their answer about their experience to this answer about their experience. So scheduling refers to the level of preparation that you're bringing into the interview. So given this, right, we talked about in this class the role of open versus close-ended questions. Again, close-ended questions are very much designed to seek a shorter answer. They're about gathering data that can be more generalizable, right? Open-ended questions are about seeking out people's insights, their thoughts, their perspectives, and their opinions. So given that, there are a variety of different ways that you can organize questions within an interview with this in mind, right? The first one is what's called the tunnel or the string of beads sequence. So the tunnel is very much asking the exact same level of open or closedness for each question and just kind of working down the line to do that. So for example, you might use the tunnel or linear process if all of your questions are asking people to measure something in a scale. So maybe it's all close-ended. On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about dining at UU? On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about athletics at UU? On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about academics at UU, right? So it's very much the same level. And this can be useful as you're gathering information, but it can also be a challenge to effectively organize your data if you are not allowing for open-ended questions or opinions. Then we have what are known as the use of the funnel. Right? So the use of the funnel is going from very broad, open-ended questions down to narrow, more close-ended questions or specific questions, right? So generally, the funnel is a really good way to gauge people's comfort, their interest. It's oftentimes used in an information-giving interview, right? Where the interviewer has things that they would like to share. For example, if you are meeting with a recruiter who's trying to get you involved in an athletic team or an extracurricular at EOU, they might start with very open-ended questions. They might want to learn a little bit about you, where you're from, some of your interests and hobbies, right? They want to get a feel for who you are. And then once they've acquired that information, they might start to get into more specifics. Have you considered doing football at EOU? Are you aware about some of the things that we offer here at EOU, right? You start to get into a bit more of that information later. The advantage to doing this is it allows you to build rapport. It allows you to build a close connection with people early on. It allows people to speak their piece and get their mind in. And then when you get to the closed questions, generally speaking, people are not going to add extraneous, irrelevant information because they've already gotten that out there early on. If you flip this around, right, you have what's known as the inverted funnel. Kind of looks like a beaker. So an inverted funnel is a type of question sequence that starts very specific, very narrow, very close-ended. This can be really commonly used if somebody is starting out by seeking out demographic information and other data, right? So they want to figure out, okay, what is your name? What year in school are you? And they just have like a checklist of things that they have to figure out. And then it might open up later and provide more opinions, thoughts, and perspectives. For example, I was recently asked to complete a Gallup poll that was just like gauging, first of all, my opinions about various topics from like strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then at the end of the interview, they asked me to do more of an expressing my opinion and sharing my thoughts on particular topics, right? So moving to an open-ended later is a way to help us interpret the data that they might have provided early on and to do so in a clearer way. There are also some combinations that can be used here, right? So one combination here is what's known as the hourglass, where you start with open-ended questions, right? You start with helping people get comfortable. You get to some close-ended questions toward the middle, seeking out very specific information. Then you open things back up again in the end. One way of doing this is to open up for people to express their thoughts or ideas later on, right? The use of clearinghouse questions that allow people to share any remaining thoughts or concerns. Another way of doing this is the opposite, right? It's a diamond, where you start with the close-ended questions. You start with the basic information. You very much open things up. You allow people to express their opinions, thoughts, and ideas. And then you close things back up at the conclusion, just to make sure that you're wrapping things up and gaining the basic information that you need for the end. There's also another kind of method of sequencing that is called the quintidimensional, right? So this is a way that you might structure, first of all, about awareness. Did you know that this product exists and can really help you to get out stains in your vehicle? There's uninfluenced attitudes, right? So generally speaking, do you clean your car? Specific attitudes. How do you feel about this particular cleaning product? Why do you feel the way that you do about this particular cleaning product? And how intensely do you feel? Or do you like absolutely hate this product because it releases really bad smells into your car, right? Or do you really like this and use this a lot? So this can be a way to measure people's attitudes and opinions. And again, this is a method of structuring interview questions, making somebody aware, helping to understand their general ideas, helping to understand their ideas on the specific issue, why they feel the way that they do, and the intensity through which they feel. This is used a lot in a lot of like focus groups or customer satisfaction oriented interviews too. One really important element here is the idea of developing a good interview climate, right? The idea here is that you develop rapport, which is developing a relationship between the interviewer and interviewee that is allowing them to open up and feel trust with each other. I like to use the story, right? The wind and the sun are having a competition over who can take a person's coat off, right? The wind says, I'm going to blow really hard, and I'm going to just like knock the coat off, right? The sun says, I'm just going to be up in the sky, I'm going to be there, I'm going to be pleasant, and the person takes their coat off themselves. In the same way, if we force an interview too hard, if we're too confrontational, even if we want the questions, right, people are going to zip up their coat. But if we open up, we're friendly, we help people feel comfortable, they're going to take the coat off themselves and disclose more in the interview process. So another idea here is orientation, right? You orient people to the interview, you help them understand the purpose and goals. One way this is really important is people are very concerned about data, right? Rightly so. If your boomer grandma is posting a meme that's about like how, share the last 4 digits of your social security number and see like, what that says about you, right? Probably shouldn't do that. In the same way, people are anxious about receiving information and how that information is going to be circulated. So orientation is a good way to understand the purpose of an interview and help an interviewee feel more comfortable. This information is confidential. This information is going to be delivered to EOU administration to understand student experiences. So using orientation like that can be really effective. We might consider a variety of different ways of engaging, both verbally and non-verbally, right? You can open an interview by being really clear about the purpose, the issues, how the issues were brought up. So, we are a legal team that's investigating some of the ways that this product may have adversely affected customers, right? Explaining an incentive. Sometimes interviews are providing you with like a financial incentive for completing the interview, providing a reference, like explaining who sent you or who you're speaking on behalf of, asking questions, referring to the amount of time that the interview is scheduled for. All of these work really well as a way of setting up the interview because you're helping the interviewee gain context, right? Other things to consider are nonverbal communication, right? So one of them is territoriality, right? Is this a space that's yours as an interviewer? What does it mean to have an interview in your office versus having an interview in somebody's home or over Zoom, right? So the space that's being used and the ownership of that space is going to dictate a lot of nonverbal communication. Again, a common way of using nonverbal communication effectively in an interview is rather than having people sit across from each other at a table, using the corner, right? Having somebody sit, for example, right here, having somebody sit around the corner like this, that can be a really good way to make the hierarchy not present in the same way and feel a lot more conversation. Face, appearance, and dress. How does somebody present for an interview? That can convey your seriousness, your interest, your engagement. Again, in a lot of cases, such as a job interview, you're probably dressed up. You're probably going to dress more business formal, depending on the context. Touch, right? We should try to avoid touch when possible, but sometimes if there's a high degree of comfort or understanding, that can be appropriate. And then reading nonverbal communication. Again, the way that we use gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, proximity, those are the things that really shine and show a lot of different elements of the interview process really effectively, right? For example, there are a lot of uncomfortable ways that interviews might play out. For instance, people have critiqued and kind of taken note of how a lot of hosts might engage with physical appearance in ways that might seem like really gross. Like, for example, David Letterman would sometimes ask to touch female guests' hair, right? That stuff can be incredibly inappropriate and uncomfortable. So how we use nonverbal communication plays a really big role in how we experience and express our level of comfort with others. When it comes to wrapping up the interview, right, there are a few things that I think are useful for us to think about here. An interview is dialogue, right? It is a chance for you to raise any additional questions and issues. Also, right, don't say, oh, well, I think that wraps everything up, and then you have 5 more questions, right? Don't do false closings, right? Don't be like the end of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, where there's 5 different endings, but it still goes on for 40 more minutes, right? People need to know when it ends, and they need to feel ready to go. If they're getting false ending, they're going to be frustrated. Offer to answer questions, right? So generally speaking, in a lot of interviews, like employment interviews, the script flips, and then the person being interviewed gets the chance to ask their own questions. Clearinghouse can be really useful. Again, are there any other issues, topics, or concerns you would like me to know about? That can be a good way to wrap up. Inquiries, like what are the next steps? How long, are you going to take to reach a decision? Those can be useful as well. Sometimes you let people know that time's up, it's over. You explain why an interview is closing. I've got to go to the next meeting, but I really appreciated your time. And then talking about and preparing for what happens next if this is somebody that you meet with on a more regular basis. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways to effectively open and close interviews next class, but I didn't want to preview some of these strategies so you're a bit familiar with how this process works. So for part 2 of attendance in the last few minutes of class, I'm going to be assigning you a number between 1 and 4 and asking you to work on your own, to return to your attendance. And then using the assigned interview sequence, I just want you to take a couple notes about what you feel like the advantage of using this sequencing format might be, and some challenges with using this sequencing format. So I'm going to number you off from 1 to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, or sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So if you're a 1, you're on the tunnel sequence. If you're 2, funnel, 3, inverted funnel, and 4, hourglass. Take a couple notes here about this format. What are some of its advantages? What are some of its challenges? take another minute here. Again, this doesn't need to be a long response. This is just what is good about this format? What is a challenge to using this format? So again, as we're looking at these ways of doing interview structure, you might be thinking about what your goals are, how are you building comfort and rapport between people in the interview, what is the information that you have to acquire or provide to the interviewee, and based on that information, right, how are you managing structure and organization? You might also consider factors like time, because that can definitely be a constraint on the interviewing process. So to wrap up for today, we talked about some of the ways that we can utilize interviewing structure, organization, right? The sequence or series of questions that we ask and the way that we ask them is going to dictate the climate and elements of the interview. We're going to be applying some of these skills in terms of interview organization and structure a little bit more explicitly next class. So when you are all set, please pass forward or email your attendance prompt for the day. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you all again for Friday.